Hello, my name is Mark Stoddard. I am one of the co-chair for the SBEAP Technical Subcommittee, and I'm pleased to welcome both Gary Jones and Marcia Kinter. I have this vague awareness of meeting Marcia during I believe it might have been a 1999 Printing Association meeting in St. Louis. And from my perspective, she looked very regal, very knowledgeable, very powerful. And I think at that time, I was just trying to grasp what was, graphic arts. And at that meeting and future meetings regarding environmental health and safety, I got to meet Gary Jones. He was kind of like the purveyor of all knowledge on environmental health and safety. I remember in our annual meeting earlier this year, Gary was in this, like a pre-meeting. And I thought, oh, great. I've got this presentation and I know very little about where printers are today. And Gary was willing to spend 2 hours of his time talking with me while I was scribbling down copious notes. And so as I was drafting this presentation, both Gary and Marcia took their time to review my presentation. And they've also agreed to kind of maybe hold some preliminary talks because I like a lot of what Wisconsin is doing. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like Renee's online, but if we could do something like what they're doing, and I don't know what that future might look like. But with that being said, I welcome Gary and Marcia, and without further ado, take it away. Oh, and if everyone could mute themselves, because I'm not in control. So please mute yourself, and then post any questions you might have through the chat function. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It's Gary and I realize how long we've actually been in the industry, and we don't like to really say how long, but we do use the decades word. So my name is Marcia Kinter. I'm the Vice President of Government and Regulatory Affairs for Printing United Alliance. Now, Printing United Alliance is the merger between SGIA and Printing Industries of America, National Printing Industries of America. And as I always like to say, I came from the SGIA side. So my strength is in screen printing and in digital printing activities. So I've done regulatory work, both environmental, safety, health, as well as sustainability issues. Since I believe, Gary, I joined the industry in 1989, so I'm dating myself.
Yeah.
But we've known Mark for a long time, and we're really glad to be working with him and with the small business assistance programs, environmental assistance programs once again. So Gary, you want to introduce yourself before we start?
Yes, I'm Gary Jones. I'm Director of Environmental Health and Safety for Printing United Alliance. And probably the best way to describe it is I came more from the PIA side. So Printing Industries America's primary focus at the time was commercial printing, primarily commercial printing and some packaging. And so I always like to say between Marcia and I, we've got a lot of bases covered when it comes to the printing industry. And the printing industry is actually, and continues to be one of the largest industries in the United States in terms of numbers of facilities, employment, and output. Printing is essential to our economy. It's essential to moving goods and services. And I always like to make the statement that printing touches you every day, or you touch printing every day. There's no way to escape printing in some way, shape, or form. And the tremendous number of products that are actually printed that you interact with and probably don't realize. But as Marcia mentioned, I've been doing this since 1987, and probably known Marcia since about 1990, at least 30 years or so. We've worked together, and we've really covered a lot of the waterfront when it comes to EHS issues and printing. We've seen a lot of changes. We've seen a lot of activity, and we're excited that Mark invited us to update you regarding changes in technology for printing. So part of our presentation, we will assume that you have some knowledge about printing in the printing process. We'll try to explain a little bit as we go through printing, but like other industries, printing is experiencing, I would say, almost an evolution, or maybe a revolution, but more evolution in terms of introductions of new printing technologies that are occurring. Printers are putting these in as we speak. The industry is adopting, it's adapting, it's changing, it's incorporating these new technologies. It gives the printers new capabilities that they didn't have before. It gives them more efficiencies with respect to production. It gives them new markets that they didn't have before either with the printing technology. It's very exciting as you know, with respect to where the industry is going. So we hope to share with you during our time together some of those technologies, and then we'll talk at the end a little bit about the environmental impacts of the technologies. So.
Right. And as we go along, if you have any questions, as Mark indicated, just go ahead and put them in the chat. Because when we start looking at digital technologies, and so I've been working with digital technologies, oh gosh, since about 2000. Because of the screen market and because of the screen printing process, the digital platform, especially here, which is you're looking at a wide format inkjet press, there was a lot of ability for digital print applications to really merge into the screen printing market. A lot of the digital print shops started out as photo shops. They were photo shops, and so that was really an easy transition for them to go from photo processing to digital, because as you know, a lot of the photo processing had already moved to the digital applications. So you saw a lot of photo shops that did merge into digital printing. And so when we talk digital, we are talking, and Gary laughs at me, and I am like not very technical here, but it's really your desktop printer on steroids. Okay,
Yes.
it's not a toner. There is some toner, but primarily we're using inks. But there are various sizes of digital applications, but they all have some similar attributes. One is that their prepress is really, there's no prepress. It's a file. It's what they call ripped. Don't ask. And they go ahead and it's direct from computer to output device, which is different than a traditional, or what we call an analog print operation. Now, analog printing is not dead, not by any stretch of the imagination. But what digital did is digital gave, as Gary indicated, gave the ability for these facilities to integrate digital operations, and it has a smaller footprint. So you can see this press here. If you've been into a printing operation and you've seen a traditional offset machine, or you've seen a traditional screen printing press, you know how big they can be and how much space they take up. So when we started looking at digital, the first thing that really we saw was the influence in prepress. The days of the huge cameras went away in screen printing. We saw everyone going what we would call direct to film. So digital prepress was really the first step towards the screen industry and the commercial offset industry accepting digital applications into their facility. And then they went into digital proof pressing, and then they went to digital production. So it's been quite a journey. But as Gary and I like to say, especially if you're looking at the environmental impacts, please note, there are environmental issues associated with digital printing. Digital printing just is different. It's not, as I love to say, it's not green, which is a color. It is just different. So we do have that it is different than traditional. It is, you know, you're going to have a different look. It's going to be a different feel of what is a digital operation. So if you go into a traditional print house these days, you might see a mix of technology. They may not be just solely related to one type of application. They could have a commercial offset press, they could have screen, and they could also have digital. And there's so many different types of digital. And we've even seen, as Gary said, because it's been an evolution, we have seen the equipment manufacturers of digital going through an evolution. I mean, I have to tell you, since we started in this whole digital, you know, the manufacturers that started out are really no longer there.
Yep.
I mean, I mean, a lot of the manufacturers they've been bought and merged, and it's gone much quicker than in the analog industry. So when you always do talk about digital, you have to talk prepress or output. So when you're looking at digital, you do need to see whether or not it is a digital prepress application, which is, if you're looking at, say, a textile screen print operation, they're going to only have digital prepress. There are some digital applications, you know, digital printing presses for screen, but for apparel, your t-shirts, but primarily they're into digital prepress, which means that they are doing computer generated films or plates. Now, when you look at digital output, that's going to be a little bit of difference, because digital output is, as this machine is, it's going directly from the, you know, from the computer to the machine, and you're producing a product. Now, right now, you do have what we call flatbeds, which is that the name applies, it's a flatbed, or what this one is a roll to roll. So we are able through digital to print on flexible as well as rigid substrates. And when digital first came out, it was really only on flexible substrates. You know, when you start looking at the use of it on a rigid substrate, when it first came out, we were only looking at solvent-based inks. We're now into UV inks. They're moving into UV LED inks. We have water-based inks, and we have dye sublimation inks, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. So they're all the same. You hear a lot of the same words, just going to be the different applications and the different way that digital works versus an analog. Anything to add, Gary? Did we cover that?
No, I think that's good. I think, you know, we'll talk a little bit at the end about the environmental impacts, but by simply eliminating films and plates, for example, that's a tremendous reduction in environmental impact.
Correct.
That this technology offers from our, you know, environmental health and safety perspective. And so it really reduces that footprint of the printing industry and individual printing operations.
Correct. So when you're looking at digital prepress applications, and it's important to understand digital prepress, you might think, oh, no one's really doing that. Well, they truly are at this point, because you still have a lot of analog technologies out there. But what we are seeing is that the use of digital prepress applications, whether it's computer generated film, and Gary will talk a bit about direct to plate and direct to screen technology, which is also a digital technology. We do see that there's a tremendous reduction in the use of film, photo processing chemicals, silver bearing waste. I mean, so you do see that reduction right off the bat with the application of digital prepress. And as we've said, digital prepress is pretty much the norm, I would say. I haven't seen any cameras, and when we're talking cameras in a traditional screen application, we're talking huge. I mean, these cameras can be 4 feet long. So when they were able to remove those cameras, go to computer generated film prepress application, it was a savings in time, it was a savings in money, and it was also a savings in space that they could then turn that around and put that into press applications. So here's it's coming, maybe, there we go. Whoops, back, there we go. So here's this really kind of gives you a little bit of a look at what we're talking about when we say analog prepress. When you look at, this is what we had to do before. You had all these different steps of design and type and the camera and stripping and imaging. And, you know, when you're creating a screen, except if you're going to computer to screen technology, you're still pretty much using the digital prepress, or the almost digital prepress, because you still have to image the screen. So it's when you go to computer to screen technology that you're able to take even more steps out. So it's important when you go in and talk, or when you're talking to a print operation, that you understand and ask them, what is their pre-press applications? Are they doing digital? And then really, before you even have that question, you really do need to know whether they're screen printing, whether they're a commercial offset, whether they're a flexo house. Not so many gravure around anymore, but it's important because each of those analog processes has its own digital pre-press application. So it's, you know, even though we're saying digital and everyone thinks digital is just one big happy family, Gary and I look at digital similar to analog. You have analog printing, and under analog, you have screen, offset, some letterpress, flexo, and gravure. When you have digital, you have inkjet, you have die sub, you have flatbeds, you have roll to roll, and then you have the different sizes of the machines. So digital is as diverse as analog. Even though they use primarily the same equipment, they're printing on different substrates, and it's for different applications. So it's important for you to realize when you walk in to help somebody, what print process do they actually use? Gary, you want to talk a bit about computer to plate?
Yeah, computer to plate technology was probably as Marcia mentioned, one of the first evolutions that occurred in the industry. And the computer to plate technology is really focused on basically still analog. When we say analog, that's your traditional lithographic and flexographic screen type of printing operation. And so that really became that became the norm. And as Marcia had mentioned, you know, film, at one point we used to put images on film and then use the film to image the plate. So it was like a two-step process. And that was mechanical. I mean, that was a physical process. And what this technology provided was a tremendous reduction in labor and an increase in efficiency, and actually an increase in quality, because you eliminated the intermediate step. So basically, when you look at a direct to, I'm talking, yeah, computer plate technology, basically we're imaging those plates directly from the computer image. Next slide, please. This is an example of a computer plate system for a lithographic operation. And the plate typically used in lithographic operations or long run lithographic operations are aluminum plates. You will find some of the smaller operations with short run, they may use paper plates still, but by far, if you go into a large commercial shop, they're going to be outputting computer to plate to aluminum. And as we mentioned, the efficiencies are so great that there is, as far as I'm concerned, I have not been in a printing operation that is using film in quite some time. I would say if you ran across a printer that's still using film, I've learned never to say never in our industry because it's so large and we have such a wide variety of operations. It would be extremely rare that you would be running into a print operation that's using film. Next slide, please. The computer screen, as Marcia mentioned, essentially, again, the same benefits: elimination of film, eliminates photographic chemicals, and again, we have a higher quality image. Now, in this particular case, this is, Marcia, maybe you might want to comment on this application for screen in terms of the imaging that occurs.
Right. So essentially, you see the screen. It's this. This is the screen. And so what they're doing is this machine will go across and it's going to image the stencil, because screen printing still uses a stencil, and it's going to image the printable. It's going to set the image in a wax so that when it goes across, so that when you are done and when this comes out on the other side, you're going to see that it has a screen ready to go to press. And what this removes is it removes the need for film. It removes the need for even the vacuum press to put the screen in order to image the film onto the screen. You still have a coated screen, but it's a different type of emulsion. But you're looking at putting that image onto the screen directly with wax. It's a really interesting process, very interesting process. But as with Gary has indicated, similar to the computer to plate, the computer to screen really does give that element of quality control, a sharper image.
Okay, picking up on-demand printing. Now, typically on-demand printing is described, in at least in our world, as those that are using dry toners. And so think of it as your office photocopier on steroids. Just as Marcia mentioned, the desktop, the inkjet applications are like your desktop inkjet printer on steroids. We've seen a tremendous growth in the use of the dry toners. In fact, some of these systems rival, and they're not quite as good as the quality of analog, but they come pretty darn close. They're rivaling the quality of analog. And what I've seen in terms of these types of applications, we've seen the ability to put coatings on, the ability to use a 4-color process. In other words, you're able to print color quite readily off of these types of output devices. The advantage to using the digital technology is that typically you can personalize. So for every, you could say, for example, I'm going to send a letter to every house, on the street in your neighborhood. If you knew the name of each person, you could personalize that letter with each person's name and address. So it would appear that it was a more personal information being sent to them. And unlike your analog process where you could just print thousands upon thousands of that letter that says, dear neighbor, and the advantage of having the digital output is to allow you to actually personalize that. Now, this is an image, and what I want to do is have you focus. I can't. I don't have control over the mouse. But if you focus in the foreground here of this photo, and a little bit over to the right, Marcy. Basically, this was a 4-color dry toner. It's a Xerox machine, basically output device. And what's beautiful about this piece of equipment is that it actually bound a book. So you could actually print a book and print all the pages of a book, and you could actually have a tape bound book that's output from that device. So you're actually able to do many different steps in the print process through one particular application, one particular machine. If you look in the background above that, you can see that that's an analog heat set web offset press. And over on the right where Marcy's pointing, that's a sheet-fed offset lithographic press. So again, when you walk into a print shop or a printing operation, you'll see a mix of analog and digital technologies. And I'd say probably where we're seeing the growth is in digital. In other words, printing operations are finding the value of this digital technology, and they're making investments and they're purchasing equipment and installing a lot of digital equipment. Doesn't mean to say they're not doing some analog installations, but by far, when you look at the ratio, the digital is by far outstripping the analog installations.
Correct.
Next slide, Marcy. Oh, I think this
right.
is.
I know. So let's talk digital inkjet. Digital inkjet has pretty much the market share, the lion's share of digital printing. And so digital really does allow, as Gary indicated, that ability to personalize. So when you go through the airport, if we are traveling again, and you would see the signs and it would say, "Welcome to Chicago, visit Ruth Chris." Then you go to Minneapolis, it goes, "Welcome to Minneapolis, welcome to Ruth Chris." That's because now we're able to do shorter runs. It's more cost effective to do a shorter run and personalize the signage, the graphics, and then use them and install them in various locations. So that's the beauty of digital. Now, when you start looking at wide format printers, there's a couple of things that are a little different than analog. One, the equipment and the ink are meant to go together. And so you can't switch out inks. If it is a water-based inkjet machine, it is a water-based inkjet machine. If it is a solvent machine, it is a solvent machine. And if it's an HP solvent machine, it's an HP ink solvent machine. So it is a little different from analog in that the ink type is tied closely to the machine because of that print head. So, and we're going to see some of it in action, but the print head, which is how the ink comes out, which are very small nozzles going across the substrate, they're tied to that specific ink type. Now, there are third-party ink systems that have been credited and approved to work with certain pieces of equipment, but in order to not void their warranty on their machine, printers will need to use inks that are selected to be used with that specific piece of equipment. So within the inkjet market, you have aqueous or water-based inks, and this does include the latex ink systems. We have UV inks. We have Ecosolvent inks, which means economically viable, not ecologically viable. Yeah, just making sure that point's taken. And then we also have our dye sublimation inks, which are used on fabrics. So all those fabric banners you see flapping all over that says open, now hiring, those are all dye sublimation and are done by digital equipment. So aqueous printers. So aqueous printers, as we said, the cartridges are proprietary and they're keyed, so that they can only be used in the machine that they're designed for. And ink types and even colors cannot be switched. So you have to utilize the cartridges that are specific to that piece of equipment. Now, water-based, similar to any sort of, and I guess water-based would be similar to a screen print, a water-based screen print. You're going to use it in applications where it's not outdoors. It does not need to be durable for a long period of time. So you have to look at the product, has to meet the same parameters as it would under the traditional analog system. So if you have a sign or a graphic that's going to go outside, you're still not going to use water-based inks on it because it's going to end up going away because it's a water-based ink. So you are going to use a solvent, or you are going to use a UV curable ink system. So the product still, within the digital print family, the product still drives the choice of ink system. Does that make sense? I hope it does. I can't see anyone nodding. That's the problem with Zoom meetings. You can't see anyone nodding.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the case too with analog as well. You know, so there's no difference between that the product drives the choice of the print technology.
Correct. Correct. And in digital, oftentimes as well, the size of the print run will drive the technology.
Yes.
So there's a certain price point and cost point where it is more cost effective to do the similar, a print run by analog versus a print run by digital. Now that cost point, that point is shrinking, but there's still that point. So now we still have UV applications. There's a lot of UV flatbeds. There's a lot of, again, the ink is keyed to that particular machine. But it's the same basic technology and parameters that are used in analog UV curing. You still need the UV lamps, but that's, it's the same technology. It's just done on a digital piece of equipment. Hard to explain, but I hope it makes sense. So if you've been into a print operation, screen printing there's a lot of UV in the graphics market and screen printing. So if you've been into a screen print operation that's using UV technology, it's the same type of technology. You're just using it on a UV digital printer and realizing that that ink is keyed to that print head essentially. And then we have Ecosolvent. Ecosolvent, again, cartridge-based. Everything is cartridge-based, and you can't change it out. So if it's an Ecosolvent, which is economically viable, some of the safety data sheets, and I encourage you, if you have a printer that says, "Oh, I'm using an Ecosolvent printer, I'm fine," I encourage you to look at that safety data sheet. Yeah, you'd be surprised, because they're not really environmentally sensitive sometimes. So you do need to make sure that if they understand that eco means economic and not ecological, because there's still some things in there that may cause it to be a hazardous waste. Still may be some things in there that cause it to emit VOCs. And similar to the analog ink systems, all the digital ink systems, like, you know, they emit volatile organic compounds. They may emit them at different levels. They don't emit as many because you're not using as much ink to produce a product, but they're still emitting VOCs. Now, when you go into a shop, they will often tell you that they have a control device, because a lot of printers do come with an air exchange filter for indoor comfort. So the air exchange filter for indoor comfort, it's not really destroying the VOCs, it's capturing the solvent odors. So, you know, understanding that similar to analog technologies, sometimes printers don't understand what the actual control device is doing. So there are a lot of printers that come in with these comfort filters, filtration systems. I don't know, air purification units. Wouldn't we call that what they are, Gary? Air purification units?
Yeah, I mean, it's really more for indoor air quality than it is for like a traditional. When you think of the term control device, immediately what comes to mind for me is a regenerative thermal oxidizer, you know, that is having emissions from solvent base or a heat set web press ducted to it, you know, so it
Right.
isn't that type. It's really more for indoor air quality.
Correct. And then finally, we have our dye sublimation. And dye sublimation in textile printing is really a growth market. You print on a variety of fabrics, and it is for printing on fabrics. You'll see, and dye sublimation is used in the textile industry as well. So sometimes when you see those shirts that are printed all over with a wild pattern, that is often done through dye sublimation. But it's also printed on for all our fabrics and all our signage. If you go to Vegas and you see the huge building wrap that goes down the side of the building and it looks like it's a curtain, that would be digitally produced. We do bus wraps, digitally produced. There's, as Gary said, everything you see and touch on an everyday basis is printed at some level. And some things that you see, you don't realize are printed. It's very.
Yeah, you just absorb it. Like, for example, a lot of the decorative and vanity license plates, not the ones that depending what state you're in. Here in Pennsylvania, we only have to have them on the back of our vehicles, but on the front of our vehicles, even a license plate, if say you have whatever you know of your favorite sports team, for example, in many instances, those could also be dye sublimation printed. So it's amazing when you start thinking about the things that are printed and how you interact with them.
I know. Oh gosh. Okay. All right. Let's see if I can get this video to go. Come on. There we go. I turned down the noise. So here we're seeing, we wanted to give you a little bit of a snippet. So here you can see this is a fabric printer. You can see here the fabric going up into the system. And then we're going to go across to the other side of the machine. And here it is coming out. So this going through has the ink system in it, and it also is the digital print head. And you can see it's going across and it prints. So digital prints 4-color process. That is what digital prints. The big thing is they may do a white spot color, but essentially it is 4-color process. And you can see here, this is fabric being digitally produced. And then it goes through the dryer. We have another one, if I can get it. Come on. There we go. So here you have, this is a digital flatbed operation, and I hope you're starting to see the similarities. You still have the print head going across, and I believe this must be a UV, Gary, because I see the flashing of the lights.
Yeah, it looks like UV cured to me.
Yeah, but you can see on here, sorry, I'm pointing, you can still see they have the registration marks that you would see on an analog, because it's still printing. We still are printing in drops and pixels. We're just printing through a small inkjet head. And you can again see here it's going across and it's, you know, completing the process. it's just, to us, it's just fascinating. We love to talk printing. Okay. All right, Gary, up to you.
All right, so we've been focused a lot on inkjet, and I would say by far in terms of technology, inkjet has emerged as a technology that's you don't really use the word winner, but it is kind of a winner. In other words, there's a lot of applications. The investments that are going into inkjet are just improvements are happening every day. We also wanted to share with you another digital output process called, for lack of a better term, HP Indigo. It's proprietary to HP, and this technology is growing leaps and bounds in the commercial printing world and in the packaging printing world. And now it's starting to enter into the corrugated packaging world and flexible packaging. So it would be not uncommon for you to run across essentially an Indigo and actually a lot of printers might have several Indigos. And originally when this technology came out, they were basically sheet fed. What this image depicts is a web fed. Now in our world, sheet fed, as the name implies, or individual sheets are fed through the press, and webs are continuous rolls of paper. When you get into a web press, your efficiency and productivity go up because you're continuously feeding the paper with less delay. When you have a sheet fed press, you think about it, you have to grab each sheet and run it through the press individually. In this case, this is a web, which is just unwinding and rewinding on the far end. And I believe the next slide, Marcia, we have a video of what an HP, what it looks like in operation, an HP Indigo. And the best way, as this video is playing, it runs for about a minute. The best way to think of an Indigo press is like a digital offset press. And what I mean by that is that what you're seeing here is the equivalent of a festoon on a web press. This allows the paper web to be controlled. And this is really the heart and soul. This is the digital print engine, as they say. And what, as Marcia has shown on the textile, essentially what you're able to do with digital technology is you're able to print the complete image without having to pass it through. On an analog, we would have to pass that through different heads or different print units to be able to get a 4-color image. And so the way that the Indigo works is it works similar to a photocopier where you have a drum that is electrostatically charged with the image. The ink is attracted to that charge. It adheres to that image area. It's then transferred to a rubber covered cylinder called a blanket. And then in turn, the blanket transfers the image to the printed substrate. And so you have the ability to do, I think it's just playing again, Marcy, so we can, yeah, we can move on. So you have the ability with an Indigo to customize each image, because each time you think of a print run of one, but you also have the quality that is getting pretty darn close to offset quality. The ink systems are very similar to offset inks. Offset inks use ink oils, and the Indigo ink systems use what are called imaging oils. And when you look at the physical characteristics of those are pretty close to each other. So it is a really cool process in terms of the digital application. And this image is just depicting the fact that Indigo is now making its way into flexible packaging. And flexible packaging, think of like a potato chip bag. We think of rigid packaging, you think of like a cereal box, something along those lines, and corrugated, we're all familiar with, our cardboard boxes. So HP is really moving into new markets with their Indigo. Now, this to me is absolutely fascinating. This is the HP Color Inkjet Web Press. There are competing, I know we're featuring HP, but there are many other manufacturers now that are looking at a web. If you remember the images that Marcia shared with you, I guess the roll-to-roll was kind of a web, but this, when you think of this, the size of this machine, it literally takes up a good portion of a room. And so this was HP's response to the inkjet revolution or evolution in terms of commercial printing. And if you look at the arches, within those arches, and this is an amazing statistic, is that there are 1 million, think about this, 1 million inkjet heads in that arch. And at any one time, half of them are firing. And then if one doesn't fire, there's one sitting right behind it that fires an inkjet, a drop of ink onto that passing web to make sure that your image stays in register and is clear in fidelity. And so the way these presses are set up is you have the web, you have the print engine, and then there's actually a dryer that the web goes through, and then it goes to a rewind roll, or in some cases it actually goes off to be cut and finished, depending upon the setup. And this one here is just going from a roll-to-roll application, but it's a much larger and the throughput is much greater. Next slide, please. Environmental issues. Well, as we have covered, inkjet inks, as Marcia mentioned, some of them are water-based, some of them are UV, and some of them are solvent-based. So when you have the solvent-based inkjet inks, those more than likely are going to be considered a hazardous waste because the flash point on those solvents are going to be below 140 degrees Fahrenheit. We do, as Marcia mentioned, the inkjet inks do emit VOCs and HAPs, and also indigos do emit VOCs. What's interesting about the indigo system is that they have an onboard recovery system for the imaging oil. The primary VOC in an indigo is going to be the imaging oil. And as each generation has come out, HP has gotten way more efficient. In fact, the newer indigos that are coming onto the market, they're recovering close to about 95% of the imaging oil, and they reuse the imaging oil in essence, what the imaging oil is used to do is to dilute the ink to make it more fluid so it can be applied. And then imaging oil is then recaptured within the press, and it's reused within the press. And so that has dropped the cost of utilizing indigos quite dramatically because you don't have to keep buying all this imaging oil. You can keep reusing it and reusing it. And in turn, that significantly reduced the VOC emissions. So some of the inkjet inks, solvent-based and water-based, have HAPs. Again, typically printing operations are not large sources of HAPs. We always like to say we use lots of little bits of HAPs. But VOCs by far are prevalent in the solvent-based and also water-based. You do have VOCs in there. They're not completely VOC-free. As Marcia mentioned, Ecosolvent inks are more economically viable, not environmentally viable. I know that one manufacturer of an Ecosolvent ink said, well, our solvents are derived from natural sources from plants. And we're like, well, it's still a solvent and it still gets emitted to the air. So again, it's more economically viable and not necessarily environmentally viable. And that's why Marcia suggested look at the SDS, ask for the SDSs to look at what the ingredients. And as we said, indigo emits VOC and generates waste imaging oil. And depending on what state you're in, and there's not many, but some states classify the imaging oil as a hazardous waste. The two that jump to mind immediately are California and Massachusetts, but there might be some other states that also would classify that oil as a hazardous waste. Spent direct-to-plate chemistry, again, if you're in the prepress area, back to our prepress in the beginning of our presentation, the beauty of the system is the efficiencies and reductions of film. And in most instances, that chemistry that is in your computer-to-plate chemistry, at least for the lithographic operations are concerned, the pH can be relatively high. So you have to be careful. And in many instances, that pH has to be neutralized. And after that, then the printer can usually discharge that to the sewer. But if it's being sent off site, it can go off site as a hazardous waste. And of course, we have solid waste issues. And of course, electronics are big. You see the movement towards electronic applications. All the digital applications all have computer support. And so, we're changing out computers on a regular basis. So we have disposal of computers, electronics, used equipment, those types of things. And we know that if those are recycled in a lot of states, those are considered a universal waste. If you're disposing them, though, that's a different situation if you're recycling them. And so we always encourage our members to find sources to recycle all those electronics, recycle everything you possibly can. And of course, we've always said that, but with the circular economy, that's becoming even greater. And what's interesting is there is one manufacturer out there that actually will take back their equipment and recycle the equipment. So there is one manufacturer, Konica Minolta, does a great job of actually taking back their equipment and recycling their equipment. So they don't want people disposing of it. They find value in taking that equipment back from their print customers. And brings us to the end. So I think we have some time for questions.
Yeah, so thank you. And if we'd love to have some questions, Mark, if there is any questions that have come in or anyone has any questions.
Yes, this is Mark, and I think I probably have posed a fair number of questions. Well, one comment was from my partner, Donovan, who said, yes, this is pretty cool. I especially like learning about the on-demand fabric printing. So I'm wondering, it used to be in the past that recycled content could be problematic as far as the substrate. And I don't know how that works today. If, again, there's probably a demand for more recycled content, but does that have an adverse effect on the print quality?
Yes, when you're looking at printing onto recycled content, in fact, we did a program on this actually a couple of years ago, when you have to design the piece differently. Because recycled content, especially if you're looking at a recycled content plastic, so let me just say, with digital as well as with screen, you're really looking at the non-porous substrate market. You're looking at the plastics, the vinyls you saw on the Indigo, except for the web press, which is paper. You're really looking at a lot of non-porous substrates. So when you start looking at the use of a recycled plastic substrate, you are looking at, it'll have imperfections in it. So if you have an ad campaign that's going to have a really light background or something like that, it's not going to work real well with a recycled content piece of plastic or even piece of paperboard, because the imperfections will show up. And designers do not like to see the imperfections. So you basically have to wash it out with a darker color and then put your messaging on. So it's really looking to determine how to best design and lay out the pieces of substrate for using recycled content material. A lot of people are, there's, even in our fabric banner material, they're, using recycled water bottles and things like that into our banner material. But you also have to be cautioned that a lot of the recycled content plastics cannot be recycled, because you now have many different layers of plastic and many different compositions. And so it's not just look at what California has done just recently with their truth in labeling for recycling content. You really have to be careful, because when you have a recycled content material, especially with ink on it, it may or may not be recyclable.
Okay.
Yeah, let me, Mark, let me add to what Marcia said in terms of recycled content from a commercial printing application, which is pretty much paper. In that case, all of those hurdles have been overcome.
Right. So
printing on like commercial work on paper. So if you think of magazines or flyers or things like that, printing on recycled paper from those applications, we have not encountered any issues in quite some time.
Right, very different. Recycled content paper, very different than recycled content plastics. And plastics is that, again, that really generic large word.
Right. Polyethylene, polypropylene are common plastics.
Right.
So you mentioned water-based inks, and I know I probably have a misconception, because back when I was looking at, up and coming water-based inks, and I'm probably mistaken, but it seemed like soy-based inks were the only water-based at the time.
You're looking at a different,
what is a water-based ink?
So soy-based inks are only for commercial print. They're not for any other print process. They're not used in digital or screen. So water-based inks is where water has replaced all or a portion of the solvent as the oh God, I'm forgetting the right word, Gary.
For soy-based inks?
No, for water-based inks. Water has replaced solvent as the
Carrier?
carrier. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, can you tell I'm
Sorry.
getting over a cold? So there still may be in some solvent, in some water-based inks, there still may be some solvent. Now in water-based textile inks for the screen process, there's very little solvent in them because you don't need that much solvent for a carrier. So you can have water as the primary carrier. Plastisol inks are still very heavily used in the textile print, screen print industry. So when you're looking at a water-based ink, again, it's important to look at the safety data sheet because you also have latex ink systems that are considered water-based ink systems that do have some solvent in there as part of the carrier base.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Speaking of cleaners, Gary had mentioned some cool types of cleaning applications that greatly reduce the amount of waste cleaner that's generated. So I don't know if you could kind of just briefly describe the change in how cleaners are used.
Well, here's a good, and we kind of, I guess we didn't really stress this. When it comes to the digital technology, there's another significant reduction in the use of cleaning solvents.
Mhm.
In an analog traditional print operation, it's not unheard of for printers to buy 55-gallon drums of solvents on a regular basis because of the amount of cleaning that's done with hand cleaning. In the digital application, they're buying maybe a gallon or maybe 5 gallons through the course of a year. And they're using squirt bottles, pint squirt bottles, to apply a little bit of solvent to, say, clean some inkjet heads, or to clean different components of the equipment. And they're usually small components. And so when you look at VOC emission reduction, it's significant when you move to digital. But Mark, the technology you and I were chatting about was more on the analog, and it was on web presses. And it's a newer type of automatic blanket wash system that has been introduced. Now, what I did some additional research, and it's limited in its applications to central impression cylinder type presses, but it dramatically reduces the amount of solvent. But across the board, say, for example, in lithographic commercial printing, there are automatic blanket wash systems out there, and some of them are, think of them as impregnated cloths with vegetable oil or vegetable oil derived cleaners, and the VOC content is extremely low. And so we've seen a shift in the automatic blanket wash technology away from ones that generate a significant amount of waste and use large volumes of liquid to these smaller units that are more efficient, or the impregnated cloth type systems that are used to clean the blanket. So there is a lot of room for opportunity for improvement when you look at traditional analog applications. But the beauty of digital applications is that the cleaning solvent consumption drops quite dramatically across the board, for sure.
So anyone else have a question? Because I guess I think I'm monopolizing Gary and Marcy. Well, I guess I'll continue to monopolize. I just got a little bit of more time, but I'm wondering about gravure. And again, going back, I recollect visiting a packaging plant. Might have been, 2000, 2004. It was a packaging company. These presses, from my perspective or my remembrance, seemed very large. Now, I do see there are some businesses that are using gravure for a number of processes. One was a laminate system. So at what point is printing, and printing not printing, but coding? And is laminate printing, or is laminate coding?
So we look at, if you're using a print machine, excuse me, you're printing, but you may be printing what a coating primarily is an ink without pigment.
Oh, okay.
Well, yeah, Mark, great question. I would say that even in a lot of those gravure applications that you mentioned are the product, the term is used called product and packaging gravure.
Right.
And so, for example, a lot of your, interesting enough, a lot of flooring material, a lot of laminates, you mentioned laminates, a lot of that is printed.
Yeah.
And so it isn't, you don't think of it as traditional printing like words and pictures and images, but
Mhm.
it's a printed image that is getting printed on that laminate substrate, that flooring. And so it is, in a traditional sense, it is printing. And the way that the regs are set up is that if they're doing printing and coding, then it's all considered a printing operation. That just makes life a lot easier from a compliance perspective. And we work very hard with EPA and other state agencies when they're writing their state rules to make sure that the rules clearly state that if you are doing printing, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're printing, it just mean, we just say text and images, right? So so if you're printing an image onto a substrate and you're doing some coding as well, the whole operation is considered printing under the regs. So we would say those would be printing operations. And again, it's another example of how printing affects your everyday life and you don't even think about it. I mean, there are some carpeting that actually gets printed as
Correct.
well. Marcia always likes to point out, for example, in screen printing, there's a whole segment of the industry on industrial printing. And what that means is that your keypad on your microwave is screen printed. In your automobile, your dashboard and all the indicators for like your shifter, those are all screen printed and then formed. So those are still all classified as printing operations under the regulations because they are doing printing. But again, it's another example of where you interact with print and don't even realize you're interacting with print.
Right. Printing is a manufacturing process.
Thank you. Thank you both very much for this presentation. In spite of what I thought I had learned as much as you could, push down my throat, I still found that there was opportunity to learn a little bit more today. So I appreciate your willingness to put together this presentation, to share with us, our group, and hopefully, as time goes on, maybe you're willing to come back and do it again.
Oh, love to.
Yeah, I mean, we enjoy talking about printing. We could talk about printing all day. If people want to learn more, people want to learn more, we're more than willing to spend the time. What I would probably strongly suggest is everyone write down our contact information. And as you go about your day-to-day and in week-to-week activities, if there is something that comes up with printing, please reach out to us because think of us as a resource for you. We've cherished the relationships that we've built with the small business program. In fact, you are our go-to people when an issue comes up with one of our members in your particular state or territory. We reach out to you to help us help our member, if that makes sense. And likewise, we extend that offer to you that if you have any questions or issues, you come across a printing operation, you're not quite sure what to do, please reach out to us. And if we can't answer the question, we know people that can answer your question. So we're very well networked in the print community with our colleagues that have more in-depth knowledge than we do, believe it or not, on the intricacies of print, and we can get you the answers that you need. So we're really it's important to us to maintain and to grow our relationships with the small business folks because we rely upon you, and likewise we want you to think that you can rely upon us.
Thank you very much for that.